Today I will be discussing the WHO report on violence against women. But the authors of this WHO report argue that violence against women is a huge human rights violation and therefore should be addressed by governments and healthcare systems all across the globe. Research has shown that male partner violence has especially increased over the years, which is very problematic and reflects the gender disparities that we see in our social and cultural values and how they are being translated into our healthcare system. Another way violence against women has become very problematic is that it has negative impacts on essentially all aspects of health for women, and that includes mental, physical, sexual, and reproductive health. And that is large, and this violence towards all aspects of health is essentially the cause of this increasing number of women suffering violent deaths that we are seeing over time across the globe, which is very disheartening, and it's very it's just very evident. It's just very strong evidence that gender disparities are some of the underlying problems that we see with healthcare inequity and inequality across the world. And violence against women can also have a major impact on economic costs for women because of this need for healthcare services that might not be set in place in certain areas. For example, in a lot of cultures, there's the view that birth control and abortion are taboo, and talking about sex in general is considered taboo. And therefore, abortion clinics might not be established, or healthcare systems where accessibility of birth control might not be available. So sometimes these women are suffering huge economic costs because either they don't have access to these services or it's very expensive to obtain these services, which I find really interesting because in the US, Viagra, which is a medication taken mostly by men, is covered by health insurance in the United States, and yet birth control, such as the pill or IUDs, they're not covered by health insurance, which I think is a really interesting disparity and a very confusing disparity to me. Another big economic cost could be the time taken away from employed work, that women may have to take because of this, because of the time that it takes to recover from these traumatic incidents of rape or domestic violence that could impact the amount of income a woman could make in that certain period of her life. And also it could affect access to education, higher level education, which in turn can affect women's ability to have higher paying jobs. And the report also discusses how the health burden is much higher than any other public health priority. And I think that's a very shocking fact because this is a phenomenon this is a trend that is happening all over the globe at alarming rates, and it essentially is the core of all the other problems that we are seeing, such as the high rates of unwanted pregnancies, the high rates of HIV/AIDS, or the high rate of STIs. It's because I feel like there is this lack of knowledge and information regarding sexual health, but also because there's these social factors that go into gender relations and how the health of a woman may not be as highly regarded as the health of a man or the authority of a man. And I think this is really reflected in the issue of Planned Parenthood funding in the US, So around this past April, President Trump signed a law that essentially cut funding for Planned Parenthood. And I think this really reflects this global issue of gender disparities and in the context of health, because the budget cuts were definitely done for very political reasons. Um, the Trump administration has a very strict anti-abortion stance, and that translated to them cutting the budget for Planned Parenthood funding, which is really unfortunate because Planned Parenthood isn't solely about abortion. Planned Parenthood also provides birth control, family planning, as well as other really important resources for underprivileged women and families. And that takes up the majority of their funding. Abortions, I believe, only makes up a very small percentage of the funds that they actually receive. So the fact that Trump decided to cut the budget for Planned Parenthood, is a very significant event, because it really reflects this ongoing gender disparity between men and women, and how that really affects women's access to health and access to basic resources, from whether it's education or actually getting birth control or getting an abortion for unwanted pregnancies as a result of rape or domestic violence, or the failure to use protection. I think this really does reflect this global issue, and how Trump, who happens to be a man, with his administration that also happens to be primarily male, essentially making decisions for women for experiences that they do not understand, or they will not fully understand, because of these physical differences between the genders. And this failure to try to understand or to try to sympathize with women who have to deal with these physical ordeals, not even just pregnancy, but also menstruation and among other things, is very disheartening, because it just kind of perpetuates this idea that men are superior to women, and men know what's best for women, even though that's not always the case. That's definitely not the case in this scenario. So the WHO report is definitely very relevant to even developed countries around the globe, and it really just reflects the need to really address these gender disparities and these gender inequalities, so that we can work towards an equitable healthcare system. Thank you.